Beneath the polished streets of a brand new neighborhood and behind the rows of bright siding and manicured lawns lay a secret no one expected. A truth so carefully hidden that when it came to light, it would unravel every promise the community had been built on. 96 families believed they had found security, yet the very soil under their feet was never the developers to give, and the silent figure who held the true claim had been waiting, patient and prepared, for the moment to strike. When the revelation came, it was not just property lines at stake, but dignity, justice, and the price of arrogance. Stay close, leave a like if this story grips you, subscribe for more, and share in the comments both your thoughts on the twists and the place you're watching from. Evelyn Parker, a 63-year-old retired librarian in suburban Georgia, owned nearly 40 acres of farmland passed down from her parents. She had walked those acres since childhood, her small feet once brushing through tall summer grass as she chased fireflies at dusk. Her father, a man whose hands bore the calluses of mill work and whose words carried the gravity of lived truth, often reminded her in those walks, "Land is the one thing they'll never make more of. Guard it, Evelyn. Guard it with everything you have." She listened, memorized, and carried his lesson into every stage of her life. To outsiders, the land looked unimpressive, clay soil stubborn and uneven, pine trees standing irregular and sharp against the horizon, fences long weathered and markers rusting near the corners. Developers had driven past for years, shaking their heads at what they called wasted potential. But Evelyn never once considered letting it go. To her, every patch of stubborn clay was sacred, every crooked tree a chapter of her family's story, every weathered post a symbol of survival. Unlike many who inherited property but failed to maintain it, Evelyn treated stewardship as a calling. She paid the taxes meticulously each year, filing away receipts in a neat stack, each one dated and signed. She kept her father's notes about boundary lines and her mother's reminders about payments in a fireproof box under the living room window. And she even color-coded folders to separate probate records from county maps. It was not just documentation, it was her fortress. Twice a year, she would drive to the courthouse in downtown Macon, a thermos of tea in her passenger seat, and march up the marble steps to review county records. Clerks teased her about being old-fashioned, saying she was one of the last to still show up in person, but she always smiled and replied, "That's because I don't like surprises." They thought her cautious, perhaps overly so, but Evelyn knew caution was the only thing standing between her family's legacy and the hunger of developers who never slept. Her cousin Leonard often walked the land with her in spring, helping her note which fence posts leaned or which tree limbs needed trimming. He liked to say, "Still yours, Evie, no one's taking this away from the Parkers," tapping one of the old iron boundary markers with the toe of his boot. Evelyn would nod but never fully relax, because she trusted paper and law more than casual promises. That instinct led her years earlier to meet with her friend Richard Coleman, an attorney she trusted from church. She spread her yellowed documents across his desk and asked him to double-check every signature, every plat map, every chain of title. Richard leaned back impressed and said, "You've got more records here than some courthouses keep. Honestly, you're already ahead of anyone who might ever try to touch this land." Evelyn only smiled tightly and replied, "Better to be ready before the storm comes." Richard helped her file a quiet title action, ensuring the courts reaffirmed her ownership in clear language. That step, what she called belt and suspenders lawyering, became her secret weapon, a safeguard she prayed she would never need, but kept polished and ready all the same. For Evelyn, the land was not simply property. It was the living proof of her parents' sacrifices. She remembered her father's long shifts at the mill, the way he came home exhausted but still walked the edges of the field with her, explaining why certain corners mattered. She remembered her mother's patience stretching groceries to make sure the tax bill was always paid. She remembered evenings on the porch listening to them argue quietly about money, but always agreeing on one point. No matter what happened, the land had to remain theirs. That belief was sewn into her soul. Retirement had given Evelyn more time to tend to her fortress. Where others traveled or sought hobbies, she poured her energy into maintenance. She trimmed trees, marked boundaries, and attended county meetings where developers lobbied for zoning changes. She was not loud or disruptive, But she listened, made notes, and reminded herself that vigilance was her duty. Even as nearby fields turned into gas stations and strip malls, her acres stood untouched. People wondered aloud why she refused lucrative offers, why she clung to what they called inconvenience. But Evelyn knew better. Money could vanish, markets could collapse, but land was permanent, and hers carried the weight of blood and history. She had seen too many families lose everything by neglecting paperwork, by failing to watch their property lines, by trusting those who smiled while planning to take advantage. She had vowed long ago she would never become one of those stories whispered about in barbershops or church halls. When brokers knocked on her door, dressed in suits and eager to pitch promises, she always answered calmly but firmly. "This land isn't for sale," she would say, looking them directly in the eyes. "It isn't just mine. It belongs to every memory I carry." They would shift uncomfortably, scribble notes, and retreat, but she knew they would be back in some form, because ambition never stopped circling. She knew a storm was always brewing somewhere beyond the horizon. Still, Evelyn never let fear drive her choices. She carried herself with patience, the quiet strength of someone who trusted preparation more than noise. She spent her evenings sipping tea on her porch, watching the sunset dip beyond her pines, whispering prayers of thanks for another day her land remained hers. Evelyn pulled her car to the side, heart pounding, and stepped out into the heat. She flagged down a worker carrying blueprints, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Excuse me, sir, what's going on here?" The man barely glanced up from his papers, sweat glistening on his brow. "New subdivision, ma'am. Oakwood Springs. 90-something homes going up. Gonna be beautiful." He tipped his hard hat in casual politeness and walked away as if she were invisible. Evelyn stood frozen, her breath shallow. 90 homes? On her land? At first she thought it had to be a mistake, some misfiled permit or project mapped to the wrong parcel. Surely no professional developer would pour concrete without checking records. She drove away that day in disbelief, but something gnawed at her chest. A week later she returned, and her worst fears solidified. Wooden frames now rose like skeletons against the sky. Concrete foundations spread across the ground like teeth, and the smell of freshly cut lumber carried on the breeze. It was no accident. They were building a neighborhood on her property. She drove home with her jaw clenched, her mind racing between rage and calculation. At her kitchen table, she spread out her papers, deeds, and receipts, tracing the lines of ownership back through decades. The land was hers, there was no question. Yet outside her window, the sound of construction echoed faintly, a cruel reminder that possession on paper meant little if people with power ignored it. She told Leonard about it the next day, her voice low but sharp. He shook his head in disbelief. "They can't just build without asking, Evie. That's madness." Evelyn tapped her folder of documents, her lips pressed tight. They didn't ask, and they didn't check. She shared the news with friends at church, but many didn't believe her at first. Some thought she was exaggerating. Others insisted the county would never allow such a blatant theft. Yet Evelyn had the evidence, yellowed but intact, every tax receipt with her name, every plat map showing her boundaries. She carried it with her in a folder, showing anyone who doubted. "It's my land," she repeated, steady as stone. What she did not yet know was that the Oakwood Springs Homeowners Association, led by the ambitious Leonard Blake, had partnered with Westwood Builders on an expansion. They had purchased adjacent parcels, and due to a clerical error from decades ago, her 40 acres appeared in county records under a vague description, almost invisible to casual review. To the developers, it looked like unclaimed land waiting to be transformed into profit. To Evelyn, it was theft dressed in paperwork. Within weeks, the site became a hive of activity. For sale signs popped up at the edge of the road. Realtors in press suits waved glossy brochures, describing dream homes starting at $299,000. Moving trucks lined up, eager families toured model houses, children laughed while running across freshly paved cul-de-sacs. Each time Evelyn drove by, she felt her chest tighten. These strangers were claiming what her parents had bled to preserve, their curtains already hung in windows that stood on Parker soil. It was not just insult, it was invasion. Yet Evelyn did not shout, did not chain herself to a tree or march with signs. She chose the path she knew best, patience and evidence. Each evening she sat at her dining table, spreading documents like battle maps, circling dates, and drafting letters with Richard Coleman. She snapped photos from public roads, filmed construction crews pouring concrete, and logged each event in a binder labeled Oakwood Springs. Leonard asked her once why she didn't call the news, why she didn't raise a storm of protest. Evelyn's reply was firm: because they expect noise. Noise fades. Paperwork doesn't. Still, the audacity of the HOA left her reeling. One morning, she found a glossy flyer in her mailbox advertising the very homes rising on her soil. She stared at the picture of her land printed in vibrant ink and let out a short, bitter laugh. "The nerve," she muttered. At their next meeting, Richard studied the flyer with a grim frown. "They're not hiding it," he said. "They're daring you to challenge it." Evelyn folded the paper and tucked it into her binder. "Then that's exactly what I'll do." The deeper she looked, the more she realized how reckless the developers had been. Clerks had flagged discrepancies in acreage reports. Accountants had raised quiet concerns. But Leonard Blake waved them off. His philosophy was always to build first, fix later. He wanted a legacy, a crown jewel subdivision to bolster his reputation. He never considered that a single woman in her 60s, armed with paperwork, could dismantle everything he built. Evelyn began to feel the weight of loneliness in her fight. Some church members whispered that she was being selfish, standing against families who only wanted homes. A neighbor suggested she take the money and walk away. But Evelyn's conviction only deepened. This was not about cash. It was about dignity, about keeping her parents' voices alive, about ensuring arrogance did not trample justice. She knew the families were innocent, victims themselves of leaders who had gambled with lies. But her responsibility was not to ease their comfort. Her duty was to protect what was hers. In quiet moments, she prayed for strength, not vengeance. She asked for the courage to withstand the storm she knew was coming, for patience when others called her heartless, for resolve when pressure mounted. Each prayer was a shield. Each page of her binder was a sword. By autumn, the development looked unstoppable. The original deed from her father was intact. Every tax receipt carried her name. Every probate record showed the transfer of ownership from her parents to her. But somewhere along the way, a line in the county plat had blurred her parcel into ambiguity. On paper, to the untrained eye, it looked as though the acreage was unclaimed. To the Oakwood Springs Homeowners Association, led by Leonard Blake with his silver tongue and hunger for recognition, it looked like opportunity waiting to be seized. Leonard was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and sharp-dressed, always eager to charm bankers and developers with promises of progress. He had spent years cultivating his reputation as the man who could get things done, the president of the HOA who would transform sleepy corners of Bibb County into thriving neighborhoods. When Westwood builders approached him with their plans to expand, Leonard saw his crown jewel in the making. The adjacent parcels were easy enough to buy. The banks were willing to finance. And when one of Westwood's junior project managers flipped through a faded map and pointed to a parcel still labeled Parker, Leonard waved it off. "Paperwork error," he said confidently. "Probably some old farm long abandoned. We'll clean it up later." His board trusted him, his contractors followed his lead, and the engines roared to life. They believed that land was simply there for the taking, that signatures and surveys were mere red tape, obstacles that could be bulldozed just like trees. Their arrogance blinded them to the truth that Evelyn Parker had spent her entire life preparing for. What made it worse was how quickly others fell into line. Realtors eager for commissions began advertising homes before the foundations were even finished. Local officials posed for photos at ribbon cuttings, praising Oakwood Springs as a model of suburban growth. Even the mayor shook Leonard's hand in front of cameras, proud to associate himself with a project that promised jobs, tax revenue, and prestige. To all of them, it looked unstoppable. But Evelyn watched from her modest ranch house, binder open on her dining room table. and knew that what they had built was not a triumph, but a house of cards waiting to collapse. Richard explained the situation bluntly as they sat across from one another. They assumed your land was unused because of a clerical oversight. They didn't check, Evelyn. They gambled, and they built without confirming ownership. Evelyn stirred sugar into her tea and spoke calmly. Ignorance doesn't move a bulldozer. Richard nodded, his voice measured. True. And once families move in, the stakes grow higher. They'll try to paint you as the villain, Evelyn. They'll call you cold, heartless, even greedy. They'll use those families as shields. Evelyn lifted her eyes, steady and unwavering. I've been painted worse. The truth will hold. Meanwhile, inside HOA meetings, Leonard boasted of their success. We've sold nearly half already, he told his board, tapping a PowerPoint slide with images of smiling families on front porches. This community will double in size and property values will skyrocket. Oakwood Springs will be the place to live in central Georgia. His confidence was infectious, but beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Contractors whispered about the discrepancies in land records. A county clerk quietly mentioned that the Parker name still appeared in their database. A Westwood accountant flagged an inconsistency in acreage reports. Yet Leonard brushed them all aside. Momentum is everything, he declared. If we stop now, we lose buyers. We'll settle any technicalities later. His reckless certainty became the foundation of the entire expansion. By the time Evelyn realized the scale of what was happening, the subdivision was already taking shape. Streets had been paved, cul-de-sacs named after trees that once grew on her soil, and for sale signs vanished almost as quickly as they were planted. Families rolled in with moving trucks, children pedaled bikes down fresh asphalt, and golden retrievers sniffed the corners of yards. To them, it was paradise, a dream realized. To Evelyn, it was trespass written in vinyl siding. And yet she did not hate those families. She pitied them. They were not her enemies, though she knew they would one day see her as one. They were victims of arrogance, of leaders who believed the rules did not apply to them. She told Leonard this during one of their walks across the property line. They think they're bulletproof because they have money, she said. But money doesn't erase deeds. It doesn't erase taxes paid year after year. It doesn't erase my father's sweat. Leonard looked out over the rooftops sprouting in the distance. Then you'll make them answer for it, Evie. You've got the law. Don't let them scare you. Still, intimidation came quickly. Anonymous flyers appeared in her mailbox. Neighbors whispered in grocery store aisles. At church, some avoided her pew, afraid of association. A few even accused her of trying to destroy families. Evelyn endured it all with quiet dignity, her binder growing thicker with each passing week. Every photo, every map, every notarized document became another layer of armor. She understood that the battle ahead was not only about ownership, but about perception, about whether she could withstand the tide of public sympathy manufactured by men like Leonard Blake. But she had spent decades in preparation, and she knew how to hold steady while others flailed. She had watched other people make noise before, chaining themselves to trees, screaming into microphones for local news cameras, and though their passion burned brightly for a moment, it often faded when the attention shifted elsewhere. Evelyn was not interested in fading. She believed in permanence, the kind that came with notarized signatures and certified maps. Her binder, already thick with tax receipts and title documents, now expanded with photographs of construction crews, videos shot from the public road as concrete poured into stolen soil, and flyers advertising dream homes on land that her parents had sacrificed decades to secure. Each page she added to her collection felt like another brick in a fortress that could not be shaken. Richard Coleman sat across from her most evenings, his tie loosened, eyes scanning over the growing pile of evidence. "This is more than enough, Evelyn," he told her one night, sliding a stack of receipts back toward her. "You've got every angle covered, from the taxes to the survey lines. When this goes to court, it won't just be strong, it'll be ironclad." Evelyn sipped her tea, calm but unyielding. "They think I'm just a retiree with too much time on my hands. But I've been preparing for this since before they even drew their first blueprint." She glanced at the flyer she had found in her mailbox, the one showing her land sliced into tidy lots with a price tag of $299,000. "They dared me to fight," she said, her voice low but steady. "So I will." What Leonard and his board never understood was that Evelyn's vigilance was not reactionary. It was instinct. For years, she had driven to the courthouse downtown, reviewing tax records by hand, making sure every line bore her name. She had insisted on filing that quiet title action, something most landowners never even considered, which ensured that a court had already reaffirmed her rights long before the first bulldozer rolled onto her land. To the HOA, her 40 acres looked like a blank canvas. To Evelyn, it was a fortress layered with defenses built patiently across decades. She knew that by the time the court examined her records, the subdivision would collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Still, she did not underestimate the storm ahead. Richard warned her that the HOA would argue ignorance, that they would try to hide behind the families moving in, painting her as a villain bent on throwing people out of their homes. She nodded knowingly. Ignorance doesn't excuse theft, and families don't erase deeds. The truth is on paper. That truth gave her strength, even as whispers spread in her community. Some at church whispered that she was greedy, unwilling to compromise, unwilling to accept what they saw as inevitable progress. Others suggested she take a payout and let it go. But Evelyn understood what they did not. Once you surrender to arrogance, you invite it to return again and again. Her father's voice echoed in her head every time she walked her boundary lines. "Guard it, Evelyn. Guard it with everything you have." Meanwhile, the HOA toasted their success with plastic cups of cheap wine. Leonard Blake charming residents with bold promises of rising property values and a legacy community. He posed for photographs with mayors, bankers, and builders, blind to the cracks forming beneath the surface of his project. Contractors whispered of survey discrepancies. A junior manager at Westwood Builders raised questions about Parcel 1467 still carrying the Parker name. Even a county clerk hinted to a board member that ownership looked messy. But Leonard dismissed them all with a wave of his hand. "Momentum is everything," he repeated like a mantra. "Families are buying, homes are selling, and once people move in, nobody will dare challenge us." He believed size and speed made him untouchable. He did not realize that speed only made his mistake more expensive. Every home sold, every foundation poured, every lawn mowed by a new family was another layer of liability that strengthened Evelyn's eventual claim. She understood this better than anyone. The more they built, the stronger her trap became. And so she let them build, documenting each step, adding every careless move to her evidence binder. Noise fades, she reminded herself. Paperwork lasts. Her calmness unsettled even Richard at times, who expected anger or outrage, but found instead a woman sharpening her sword quietly, steadily, with the patience of someone who knew her time was coming. One evening, as they sat reviewing her files, Richard looked at her across the table and said, "You realize they're going to try to break you down personally, right? They'll call you heartless. They'll send letters, maybe even threats. Are you ready for that?" Evelyn placed her hand over her stack of receipts and met his gaze without flinching. "I've been ready since 1988. They just don't know it yet." In the distance, the subdivision took shape. Streets paved, sidewalks poured, lamp posts standing tall at dusk. Families toured model homes. Children raced bicycles on driveways. Couples posed proudly in front of new siding. To outsiders, it looked like the American dream come to life. To Evelyn, it was trespass painted in vinyl siding, a fragile illusion that would crumble once the truth surfaced. He liked to style himself as a visionary, a man who saw possibilities where others only saw empty clay fields, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone convinced that momentum excused mistakes. At ribbon-cutting ceremonies, he spoke of legacy, of building a community that would stand for generations, while behind the scenes he dismissed every cautionary note that suggested something might be amiss. Realtors, contractors, and even county clerks whispered about discrepancies in the land records, but Leonard waved them away with a smirk and a confident shrug. "Paperwork is just red tape," he insisted. "We cut through it. That's how you make progress." His board nodded along, too enamored with his bravado to question the cracks forming in the foundation of their project. Families eager for homes trusted his charm, banks poured in financing, and local officials praised him for bringing growth. Leonard basked in the glow of admiration, blind to the storm that Evelyn was orchestrating quietly a mile away. What drove Leonard more than anything was pride. In his mind, Oakwood Springs was not just a subdivision, it was his monument, proof that he was more than a small-town HOA president. He wanted to be remembered as the man who transformed Bibb County into a hub of prosperity. That hunger for recognition made him reckless. When a junior project manager at Westwood Builders pointed out that parcel 1467 still bore the Parker name in county records, Leonard dismissed it with a chuckle. Some old farm that doesn't matter. We'll clean it up later. Later never came, because Leonard believed scale and speed would shield him from consequences. He believed that once families moved in, no one would dare challenge them, not the county, not the courts, and certainly not an elderly woman living in a modest ranch house. He saw Evelyn as invisible, irrelevant, powerless. He could not have been more wrong. Evelyn watched Leonard's arrogance play out in the local newspaper, where he gave interviews praising the community's rapid growth. "We're not just building homes," he told a reporter, his broad shoulders squared for the camera. "We're building a legacy, something families will remember as the model of suburban progress." The article was filled with glowing quotes from buyers and lenders, but Evelyn clipped it carefully and placed it in her binder. To her, Leonard's bravado was not intimidating, it was evidence. Every word he spoke in public became another layer of arrogance that would crumble under the weight of her meticulously prepared truth. While Leonard toasted with wine at HOA mixers, Evelyn flipped through receipts dated decades back. While he smiled in photographs with mayors and developers, she reread her quiet title action confirming her ownership. While he posed beside newly poured sidewalks, she marked the dates of construction in her evidence log. Their approaches could not have been more different. One relied on noise and spectacle, the other on silence and preparation. Leonard's arrogance blinded him to the simplest fact: the bigger the dream he sold, the higher the cost when it collapsed. Richard Coleman warned Evelyn that Leonard's arrogance would be their strongest advantage in court. "He believes appearances win battles," Richard said as he thumbed through the latest glossy HOA newsletter Evelyn had brought him. "But appearances fade. Judges care about facts, and you've got those in spades." Evelyn nodded, her expression calm. "Let him talk. Let him boast. Every word makes the fall harder." And boast Leonard did. At one HOA board meeting, he told residents, "Folks, property values are going to skyrocket. We're doubling in size, schools are improving, retail's moving closer, and Oakwood Springs will be the safest, strongest community in Central Georgia." The homeowners applauded, reassured by his confidence, eager to believe in the dream he sold. None of them saw what Evelyn saw: a man building castles on sand. Even when whispers of Evelyn's claim began to surface, Leonard's arrogance remained unshaken. At a mixer, he laughed off the rumors. "There's always someone trying to make noise when success happens," he told a group of residents while swirling wine in a plastic cup. "Half the time land records are tied up in old names. We cut through it. That's how progress works." Some residents chuckled along, others smiled nervously, but Leonard believed his charm had quelled their doubts. He had no idea that the woman he dismissed was watching every move, every word, collecting it like ammunition. Evelyn knew better than to underestimate arrogance. She had seen it throughout her career as a librarian, in students who thought they could outsmart exams without studying, in administrators who thought appearances mattered more than preparation. Arrogance always crumbled when tested. She knew Leonard was no different. As she watched him from afar, Evelyn reminded herself that arrogance was a trap of its own making, and Leonard had already stepped into it willingly. Meanwhile, families continued moving in, filling the subdivision with laughter, porch lights, and the smell of barbecues. To them, Oakwood Springs was the fulfillment of years of saving, a dream realized at last. But beneath their joy, Evelyn saw the shadow of betrayal. They did not know their dream homes were built on stolen ground. and Leonard's arrogance had gambled with their futures without hesitation. She pitied them, but her pity did not weaken her resolve. She would not let Leonard's lies erase her parents' sacrifices. She would not let arrogance rewrite ownership. Richard drafted a cease and desist letter with precise language and sent it directly to the HOA office. The envelope arrived on a Friday morning, landing on Leonard's desk like a pebble against a fortress wall. He read it quickly, smirked, and tossed it aside, telling his board, "This woman thinks she can scare us with paperwork? She doesn't have the resources to fight us." His arrogance, the same arrogance that had blinded him to clerical warnings and survey discrepancies, now made him laugh at the threat of legal action. But Evelyn was not bluffing. Within weeks, Richard filed suit in county court, attaching every piece of evidence Evelyn had meticulously saved over decades. Tax receipts signed and dated for every year, certified deeds, probate records proving the legal transfer of land from her parents to her, maps with iron markers that still stood in the ground, even her quiet title action reaffirming ownership. The complaint landed on the desks of HOA attorneys and Westwood builders like a thunderclap. At first, they tried to reassure Leonard. "Cases like this rarely go anywhere," one lawyer said, but when they flipped through Evelyn's binder, copied into exhibits and affidavits, their confidence wavered. This was no desperate retiree lashing out. This was a woman who had built her case patiently, line by line, receipt by receipt, with the precision of someone who had expected this very moment. Meanwhile, the first families who had purchased homes in Oakwood Springs began receiving legal notices taped to their doors or mailed in stiff envelopes. Angela Ramirez found one on her porch and carried it to her husband Victor with shaking hands. "Is this real?" she whispered. Victor read it twice, his stomach sinking. "It can't be. They wouldn't sell us a home on land they didn't own." Yet the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. In another cul-de-sac, Mark and Stephanie Cole, expecting their first child, panicked at the thought of bringing a baby into a house entangled in a lawsuit. Retirees Harold and Denise Wright, who had spent their life savings on what they believed would be a peaceful retirement, felt betrayed and furious. Whispers spread at block parties and HOA meetings. "Have you heard about the woman claiming the land?" neighbors asked each other, some dismissing it as scare tactics, others already beginning to suspect they had been sold a lie. At church, Evelyn overheard mutters calling her selfish, greedy, willing to ruin families. She held her head high, but felt the sting of their words. She knew these families were not her enemy. They were victims of Leonard's arrogance. But she also knew she could not surrender to sentiment. Her father's voice rang in her ears. "Guard it, Evelyn. Guard it with everything you have." Richard reminded her of the stakes. "They're going to argue abandonment," he warned one evening, as they sorted through the first responses from the HOA's attorneys. "They'll say you didn't use the land actively. They'll try to paint you as someone holding progress hostage." Evelyn tapped the neat stack of tax receipts between them and replied, "I paid every year while they threw parties. That isn't abandonment." Richard smiled faintly. "Then we're ready." Leonard, however, continued to project confidence. At the next HOA meeting, with worried homeowners looking to him for reassurance, he stood tall and smiled. "I want to put your minds at ease," he told them smoothly. "Yes, there's a woman making claims, but our attorneys assure us there's no merit. You have nothing to worry about." A man in the back asked loudly, "But what if she wins?" Leonard's smile faltered for only a moment before he snapped back, "She won't. Trust me, we're solid." Applause followed, but unease lingered in the room. Some residents, like Angela Ramirez, began researching Evelyn's name online. They found clean tax records going back 40 years, probate filings, even old news clippings showing her family photographed on the very land they now lived on. It dawned on them that Evelyn was not some faceless adversary. She was the rightful owner. Panic deepened. Realtors grew quiet, hesitant to sell more lots tangled in a lawsuit. Banks reconsidered mortgages, unwilling to finance homes with uncertain ownership. Contractors whispered about withdrawing crews. And in the middle of it all, Evelyn sat calmly at her dining table, flipping pages of her binder, preparing for court. She knew perception would turn ugly. She knew some would call her heartless for threatening families' stability. But she also knew she had spent her life honoring her parents' sacrifices, paying every bill, preserving every document, guarding every boundary. She had done everything right, and she would not let arrogance erase that. Richard marveled at her composure. "Most people panic in situations like this," he admitted. "But you sit here calm as ever." Evelyn looked out her window toward the glow of subdivision lights rising on her horizon and said, "Because I know the truth is on my side, and truth doesn't need theatrics." The HOA scrambled. Leonard held emergency meetings with attorneys and builders, insisting they could settle quietly. But Westwood builders grew restless. Their lawyers warned that if Evelyn's claim held, every home they built would be tied up in litigation. Investors pulled back, sales slowed, and the Golden Project began to rot from within. Homeowners turned on Leonard, some angrily confronting him at meetings. "You told us everything was fine," one shouted. Leonard raised his palms. "It is fine. This is just legal wrangling." "Legal wrangling?" a woman snapped back. "My entire retirement is in this house. If she wins, we lose everything." Leonard's confidence cracked, sweat dripping under the fluorescent lights. Still, he tried to put on a brave face for the press, giving interviews painting Evelyn as unreasonable. "We've offered her compensation," he claimed. They had believed Oakwood Springs represented stability, a safe neighborhood where their children could grow, and they had proudly invited relatives to their new housewarming only weeks before the legal notices arrived. Now Angela sat at the table, hands shaking as she reread the letter taped to their door, whispering to her husband that everything they worked for might not belong to them at all. Victor clenched his fists in frustration, vowing to fight for their family's home. But deep down he felt betrayed by Leonard, by the HOA, and by the entire system that allowed this to happen. Across the street, Mark and Stephanie Cole faced their own nightmare. Expecting their first child, Stephanie had decorated the nursery in soft yellows and blues. But when she heard whispers at a neighborhood block party that the land was under dispute, she burst into tears, terrified that their child would be born into chaos. Mark tried to reassure her, insisting that the county would never let families lose their homes. Yet his words rang hollow because he too had seen the strength of Evelyn's claim. He had looked up her name online, seen the records stretching back decades, and realized she was not some opportunist, but the rightful owner. Their excitement turned into dread, every hammering sound from ongoing construction now echoing like a countdown to disaster. Harold and Denise Wright, a retired couple who had poured their life savings into a cozy 3-bedroom home in Oakwood Springs, felt the sting of betrayal more than anything else. Harold had worked for 30 years at the post office, dreaming of a peaceful retirement where he and Denise could tend to a garden and host their grandchildren. Instead, he now paced the porch in anger, muttering that Leonard had conned them all. Denise tried to remain optimistic, suggesting they could perhaps negotiate with Evelyn, but Harold knew the issue ran deeper. This was not Evelyn's fault, it was Leonard's arrogance and the board's failure to check what should have been obvious. Yet many residents were not ready to accept that truth. Rumors painted Evelyn as the villain, an old woman determined to throw families out on the street. At church, she overheard whispered prayers asking God to soften her heart, and once while collecting her mail, a man in a pickup truck slowed to shout, "You're destroying lives, lady." The words stung, but Evelyn did not flinch. She told Richard later, "They see me as the enemy because that's easier than admitting they were deceived. But I'm not the one who sold them lies." Richard nodded, urging her to stay calm, reminding her that the courts cared about facts, not gossip. Still, Evelyn understood that optics mattered. Samuel had warned her from the beginning that public opinion would turn against her, and he had been right. Yet Evelyn's resolve never wavered. She pitied the families, but would not surrender her parents' legacy to shield Leonard's arrogance. The division within Oakwood Springs grew sharper as residents picked sides. Some, like Angela Ramirez, began to quietly defend Evelyn in conversations, telling neighbors that the real blame lay with Leonard and the developers. Others doubled down on their anger, choosing to believe the narrative Leonard spun at HOA meetings where he assured them everything was fine. "She won't win," Leonard declared confidently, even as sweat prickled under his collar. The county won't let 90 families lose their homes. But his words no longer carried the same weight. Homeowners saw the cracks in his confidence, and whispers of resignation spread. Realtors hesitated to list new homes, banks froze mortgages, and contractors pulled back. The once booming subdivision now carried an air of dread. Families who had just hung holiday wreaths on brand new doors now gathered in living rooms. Voices hushed as they debated whether to stay or flee. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued her quiet documentation. She drove through the subdivision, recording videos of construction progress, narrating details into her phone. Lot 12, framing completed. Lot 14, roof installed. It was not nostalgia, it was evidence. Her binder grew heavier, each page another nail in the coffin of the HOA's arrogance. Leonard's arrogance continued to fuel resentment. At an HOA mixer, he raised a plastic cup of wine and bragged, "Land's land. Half the time it's tied up in red tape and we just cut through it. That's how you make progress." Some residents laughed uncomfortably, others shook their heads, but Leonard believed his boldness would carry them through. He had no idea his words were sealing his own downfall, because Evelyn had already collected the receipts, the maps, the court filings that would expose every lie. The emotional toll on families deepened. Angela confessed to Victor late one night, "What if everything disappears? What if we're squatting without knowing it?" Victor pulled her close, promising they would survive, but his eyes betrayed the fear he felt. Stephanie Cole, 7 months pregnant, cried in the nursery, sobbing that she wanted her baby to have a safe home, not a house entangled in lawsuits. Harold Wright muttered bitterly that he had worked his whole life for peace, only to retire into chaos. Children overheard whispered conversations and asked parents questions no one wanted to answer. "Are we moving again? Is this still our home?" Parents reassured them with forced smiles, but when the children slept, they sat awake staring at mortgage papers and wondering how their dream had turned into a nightmare. Evelyn understood their fear, but she also knew she could not carry their burden. Her fight was not with them, but with the system that had failed them, with the HOA that had gambled with lives it had no right to gamble with. She wore a navy dress, simple and unassuming, her silver hair neatly pulled back, and though her heart pounded in her chest, her face revealed only composure, because she knew the truth was on her side and truth did not require theatrics. Richard Coleman, her attorney, carried the thick file of exhibits as they took their seats at the plaintiff's table, nodding to her with the quiet assurance of a man who had seen many cases but rarely one this solid. Across the aisle, Leonard leaned back in his chair with his team of suited attorneys, his smirk still lingering though his eyes betrayed unease, for the weight of 96 families sat upon his shoulders, families who once cheered him now glaring at him, as if he had sold them a dream built on sand. Judge Caroline Hughes entered, her gavel striking wood as silence fell. "This court will now hear arguments in Parker v. Oakwood Springs Homeowners Association and Westwood Builders," she declared, her voice steady. And in that moment, the entire county seemed to hold its breath. Richard rose first, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Evelyn Parker, has maintained continuous, documented ownership of this land for over 40 years. She has paid taxes faithfully, kept her deeds intact, and even secured a quiet title action reaffirming her rights. Despite this, the defendants built an entire subdivision without her consent, without verifying ownership, and without legal authority. This is not speculation, this is theft." The word theft hung in the air like a blade, and homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering prayers under their breath. When the defense rose, Leonard's lead attorney tried to soften the blow with sympathetic rhetoric. "Your Honor, while we respect Mrs. Parker's claims, the reality is that this land has been transformed. 96 families now live there. To grant her full control would cause irreparable harm to innocent homeowners. She is seeking a windfall at the expense of hardworking families." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but Richard leaned close and whispered, "Let him talk." The more they rely on sympathy, the weaker their legal footing. Witnesses were called. County clerks testified that Evelyn's taxes had been paid in full every single year without exception. Surveyors confirmed that the subdivision crossed directly into her parcel, their maps aligning perfectly with the old iron markers still embedded in the soil. Probate records showed the transfer from her parents' estate to her name, signed and certified decades ago. Richard presented photographs Evelyn had taken of bulldozers tearing through her fields, time-stamped videos of concrete pouring, flyers advertising homes on land that legally belonged to her, and each piece fit together like a puzzle painting one undeniable picture. Oakwood Springs was built on stolen property. When Evelyn took the stand, the room fell silent. She sat upright, her voice steady but not harsh, her words carrying the weight of memory and dignity rather than anger. "My parents worked themselves to the bone to buy that land," she told the court. "They told me to protect it, and I have. I paid every tax bill, I kept every document, I walked those boundaries year after year. I didn't build those houses. I didn't invite those families. The HOA and the builders made that choice, and now they want to make me the villain for standing up for what's mine." Some homeowners shifted in their seats, and for the first time, many saw her not as a faceless adversary, but as a woman wronged, a daughter honoring her parents' sacrifices. When Leonard was called to testify, his bravado began to crack. Richard pressed him relentlessly. "Mr. Blake, did you personally verify ownership of parcel 1467 before authorizing construction?" Leonard cleared his throat, beads of sweat forming at his temples. "We relied on our partners," he muttered. "So you didn't check?" Richard pressed again. Leonard's voice faltered. "We trusted the information available." Richard leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Trusted or ignored?" The courtroom murmured, whispers rippling through the benches as Leonard flushed red, his confident veneer crumbling under the weight of his own negligence. During recess, families huddled in the hallway, their faces pale. Angela Ramirez approached Evelyn cautiously. "Mrs. Parker, I don't know what's going to happen, but I just want you to know I understand why you're fighting. This isn't fair to you either." Evelyn touched her arm gently. "I don't blame you, Angela. You were sold a dream that wasn't theirs to sell." Angela nodded tearfully, her voice shaking. "I just don't know how we'll survive if this all falls apart." By the second week of testimony, the momentum had shifted entirely toward Evelyn. Every expert reinforced her ownership, every document pointed back to her name, and the HOA's arguments grew thinner, more desperate, more about optics than law. Their attorneys leaned heavily on emotional pleas, painting Evelyn as inflexible, but the judge's expression betrayed little sympathy for theatrics. She cared for facts, and the facts were overwhelmingly in Evelyn's favor. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on families grew unbearable. Some wept quietly in the pews as they realized their mortgages might collapse. Others grew angry and directed their glares at Leonard, who avoided eye contact with the people he had once promised prosperity. Tension boiled over at HOA meetings outside court, with homeowners demanding Leonard resign, shouting that he had ruined their lives. Realtors stopped showing houses, banks hesitated to process loans, and Oakwood Springs, once a model of suburban success, was now a neighborhood haunted by uncertainty. On the final day of arguments, Richard stood tall before the court, his voice ringing through the chamber. "Your Honor, this is not simply a legal case, it is a moral one." The defendants thought Mrs. Parker would be silent, that she would not have the resources to fight, but she did because she respected the law when they did not. They gambled with land that wasn't theirs, and they lost. The truth is in these records, and the truth cannot be ignored. The defense gave one last plea, portraying Evelyn as cold and unwilling to compromise, but the words rang hollow. She wore a gray suit that had once belonged to her late mother, the hem carefully pressed, her silver hair tied neatly back, and though her heart thundered beneath her calm exterior, she walked into the courtroom with the same composure she had carried since the beginning. Across the aisle, Leonard Blake sat hunched, his tie loosened, his skin pale, his usual bravado completely stripped away by weeks of relentless testimony. His lawyers whispered urgently into his ear, but he nodded absently, knowing they could no longer spin the facts. The families who had once applauded him at HOA meetings now glared openly, some even muttering curses under their breath, for they knew he had gambled with their lives and their homes without ever checking the simplest truth of ownership. Westwood Builders had already begun distancing themselves, their representatives refusing to appear in the final hearings, leaving Leonard isolated, the full weight of 96 families pressing down on his shoulders like an anchor. Judge Caroline Hughes entered, her black robe flowing as she ascended to the bench, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that even the sound of papers shuffling seemed deafening. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at the thick file before her, and began to speak. After reviewing the evidence presented, she said firmly, her voice echoing against the wooden walls, "This court finds that the plaintiff, Mrs. Evelyn Parker, has maintained uninterrupted ownership of the disputed property for more than 40 years. Taxes have been paid in full. Deeds have been recorded. Title has been reaffirmed. The construction of Oakwood Springs was conducted without her consent or knowledge." Gasps rippled through the room, some muffled sobs, some stunned silence. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly and whispered to herself, "Mama, Daddy, we did it." Judge Hughes continued, her tone unwavering. "Therefore, this court recognizes Mrs. Parker as the rightful owner of the property on which the Oakwood Springs subdivision was built." The words fell like thunder, shaking the very foundation of the dream Leonard had sold. Families clutched each other, some crying openly, others sitting in stunned silence. Lauren Cole, heavily pregnant, buried her face into her husband Mark's shoulder, sobbing that their nursery might not belong to them after all. Victor Ramirez dropped his face into his hands, his body trembling as Angela rubbed his back, her own tears spilling quietly. Harold Wright, the retired postal worker, sat stiff and unblinking, his lips pressed into a thin line as Denise clutched his arm, her own eyes brimming. For them, it felt as though the ground had crumbled beneath their feet. But Judge Hughes was not finished. She leaned forward, her voice steady but sharp. As for remedies, the matter of compensation must be determined through further proceedings. Hanover Construction and the Oakwood Springs HOA are liable for damages. Homeowners will not be immediately displaced, but their residency is contingent on resolution between the defendants and Mrs. Parker. Relief washed over some faces, though it was only temporary, for the uncertainty still hung heavy. They would not be thrown out today, but their future remained bound in legal negotiations. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, the air electric with a hunger for soundbites. Leonard tried to rush past, his face twisted in anger, but questions chased him. "Mr. Blake, do you have a comment on the ruling? Mr. Blake, do you take responsibility for misleading homeowners?" He snapped back bitterly, "This isn't over," before disappearing into a waiting car, his reputation shattered beyond repair. When Evelyn stepped outside, the questions came at her like a wave. "Mrs. Parker, how do you feel about families losing their homes? Do you plan to sell the land back? Are you open to negotiations?" She paused at the top of the courthouse steps, sunlight warming her face, and spoke calmly into the chaos. This was never about hurting families. This was about protecting what belonged to me and my parents before me. The HOA gambled with lives that weren't theirs to gamble with. I did what anyone would do. I defended what was mine. Her words carried both dignity and sorrow, a reminder that justice was not always clean, that victories often came tangled in heartbreak. That evening, the atmosphere in Oakwood Springs was heavy. Porch lights glowed dimly, conversations were short, and neighbors avoided each other's eyes. Some directed their fury at Leonard, demanding his resignation, while others turned their anger on Evelyn, convinced she had stolen their stability. The community that had once sparkled with promise now sat fractured, its lawns neatly trimmed, but its trust shattered. Inside her modest home, Evelyn placed the court's ruling carefully into her fireproof safe, next to the decades of documents that had carried her through the storm. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat quietly at her table, reflecting on the battle she had fought. Nothing about her life seemed extraordinary from the outside, but she had just dismantled an empire of arrogance with nothing more than patience, vigilance, and truth. Yet as she sipped her tea, She also felt the weight of what remained unresolved. The families were not evicted, but they were not secure either. Banks hesitated, realtors withdrew, and property values froze. Some homeowners began calling lawyers of their own, seeking ways to protect their investments. Others whispered about walking away entirely, unable to live under the shadow of uncertainty. The HOA, already crumbling, faced internal revolt. Victor and Angela Ramirez tried to hold their family together, telling themselves that they were victims too, that they had been misled just as much as Evelyn had been wronged. But each night Angela stared at her children and wondered how she could promise them safety in a house that might never truly be theirs. Mark and Stephanie Cole, now cradling their newborn baby, debated putting their house on the market, but no buyers came because it would purchase a property bound in lawsuits. Stephanie wept quietly in the nursery, whispering that all she had wanted was a future for her child, not a legal quagmire. Harold and Denise Wright, hardened by decades of labor, felt the deepest betrayal. Harold muttering angrily on the porch that he had given his life to service only to retire into chaos, while Denise tried to keep faith but saw the despair etched into her husband's face. Within the neighborhood, the anger turned sharply toward Leonard Blake, who had resigned in disgrace, vanishing into obscurity with the weight of 96 families' fury behind him. At the final HOA meeting he presided over, voices rose in fury, accusations flew, and Leonard offered only a hollow apology before slipping out under a chorus of shouts. His legacy not of progress, but of betrayal. Hanover Construction, eager to limit damage, opened negotiations with Richard Coleman, proposing a settlement to transfer ownership rights back to the HOA in exchange for a substantial sum. But Evelyn was not quick to agree. She listened carefully as Richard explained the numbers, the legal angles, the potential outcomes. And then she shook her head, her voice steady. This isn't just about money. They need to feel the weight of what they did. Every shortcut, every assumption, every lie, they thought I wouldn't fight. Well, I did, and they will answer for it. Yet Evelyn was not without compassion. She knew families like the Ramirezes and the Coles were caught in the wreckage of someone else's arrogance. And one Sunday afternoon, she attended a community meeting at a local church where many of the homeowners had gathered. The air was tense when she walked in, and conversations hushed as eyes turned toward her, some filled with resentment, others with cautious hope. Evelyn stood at the front, her posture straight, her voice calm but firm. "I don't hate you," she began. "I don't want to see you suffer. But this land was stolen from me, and I could not stand by and watch. What happens next will depend on negotiations, but I want you to understand, I am not your enemy. The ones who sold you false promises are." The words rippled through the crowd, and while some crossed their arms in anger, others softened, realizing she was not a monster tearing down families, but a woman defending her parents' sacrifices. Angela Ramirez stood up, her voice trembling as she said, "She's right. She's protecting what's hers. Any of us would do the same." The room fell quiet, and though division remained, a seed of understanding began to grow. Evelyn's fight had become more than a lawsuit. It had become a parable whispered across the county, a story retold in barbershops, diners, and church pews. People spoke of the quiet woman who had stood against an entire system, who had prepared patiently for decades, who had dismantled arrogance not with shouts, but with records and truth. She had shown that ordinary people, when vigilant and steadfast, could stand up to institutions that believed themselves untouchable. For the homeowners, the future was uncertain. Negotiations dragged on, settlements were debated, and some families never fully recovered from the scars of betrayal. Yet even in their pain, there was a lesson carved deep. Shortcuts often leave scars, and trust placed in the wrong leaders can cost more than money. It can cost peace, dignity, and stability. For Evelyn, the lesson was personal, but also universal. As she walked her boundary lines once more, Leonard by her side carrying a thermos of sweet tea, she paused by one of the old iron markers that had stood since her childhood. She ran her hand across the rusted metal and whispered, "Daddy told me to never let this go." Leonard's voice was thick with pride as he replied, "You honored him, Evie. You honored both of them." In the distance, the rooftops of Oakwood Springs gleamed under the afternoon sun, not as symbols of defeat, but as reminders that vigilance and patience had carried her through, that truth had triumphed over arrogance. Evelyn knew her fight had never been about wealth or revenge. It had been about respect, about dignity, about proving that silence did not mean surrender. She had been underestimated, dismissed, mocked, but in the end she had not been defeated. Her parents' legacy was intact, her name affirmed in court, her fortress of documents validated for the world to see. And for the county, her story became a lasting reminder that strength does not always shout, that justice does not always come quickly, but when it arrives, it is undeniable. Evelyn Parker had shown that the greatest traps are not built overnight, but patiently, brick by brick, receipt by receipt, until arrogance walks willingly into its own undoing. The end. If this story kept you on the edge, I'd love for you to support it by liking the video and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Tell me in the comments what you thought about the twists. Was Evelyn right to fight so hard, or should she have let the families keep their homes? And let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel.